I'm glad you're all here. And it's going to be kind of I guess, kind of an overview of about 2 years worth of classes in an hour. So we're going to kind of cruise through a lot of stuff. I'm going to try not to get too far into the weeds, even though I like getting in the weeds, but just kind of go over a lot of fundamentals and give you guys something to kind of some ideas to think about when you're trying to manage your property and what you might be dealing with weed wise. And yeah, so we'll just kind of get cruising. So as an overview, we'll kind of go over like what are weeds, and kind of from like more of a biological standpoint and why they might affect us, and then goals and planning on for for your property and for your weed issues, and then get into a lot of different methods for controlling weeds. The good meat and potatoes part. So, what is a weed? I would say that weeds are plants that can, displace native species and desired vegetation. This can be in a, wildlife forest habitat area. This could be in a wheat field. This could be in your backyard. But it's plants that move in and they're not the ones that you want. They can degrade the value of habitat. I've done a lot of work with that in wild areas, but also habitat for even livestock in a pasture, something like that. A lot of weeds are not desirable for forage, things like that. They can cause economic harm, especially if you're growing a crop. The weeds in there are going to displace the plants that you are harvesting. And you're not going to get as good of a yield. They also, you run over some puncture vine with your bike and now you have a flat tire. I mean, it can kind of range all over the place. They're also going to be poisonous or toxic to animals, people, your pets, things like that. So a lot of times there are certain plants you don't want in your pasture, you don't want in your yard, or even in your flower beds and whatnot. And then a lot of weeds are fairly adaptive and generalistic in that they will take advantage of any niche that they can find. If there's a little bit of soil disturbance, something gets moved, plowed, dug up, boom, they show up. And they're really good at surviving because they're not in their native range. And so they aren't being kept in check by what they normally would be in their natural environment. So they're really good at taking over niches that haven't been filled necessarily, or that the plants in this range aren't used to having to compete with. And the big thing is that they compete for resources that the plants we want need. So the big things are light, moisture, and then nutrients and space. Plants need, room to grow, things like that. So if you get something else crowding it out, it might disappear. But basically, weeds are plants that people don't want. And they could actually be native plants, but they're just not in a place where somebody wants it. So it's kind of a human construct, but it's also a big problem in a lot of settings. So the state does define weeds like as noxious weeds. This is state law from the Washington State Department of Agriculture. It's also very similar to Idaho Department of Agriculture. They have a little bit different system, but they break it down into 3 categories. And the type A, or a lot of those weeds aren't actually in the state yet, but they are ones that are on the list because if they do show up, they could be a major problem. And then type B is limited in the state. There might be areas where they are widespread, but they're not widespread everywhere. So those are looked at for control. And then type C weeds are things that are pretty much all over the state. This be like cheatgrass or things like that. Thistles are all over. Some of them become naturalized. And then there are also weeds that are important to special interest areas, whether it's wildlife habitat, things like that, or to the agricultural industry if they're competing with crops. So how do weeds spread? Where do they come from? A lot of them came as things that people brought over from Europe and planted in their garden, and then they escaped into nature and said, "Oh, this is a fun place to live." But a lot of the dispersal after that, came from, comes from wind. So you think about a dandelion, blow the dandelion, all the seeds fly off. Tumbleweeds are also really good at wind dispersal, so they break off, and then as they roll, I mean, they can roll hundreds of miles sometimes. Every time they bounce, they're just dropping seeds on the ground. Russian thistle, the tumble pigweed here. Some of these plants can produce over 100,000 seeds per plant, and then you spread that out over a 100-mile tract. You have a lot of dispersal there. A lot of the plants that I deal with at work are dispersed through water, so they get into the river, they flow downstream. Seeds or pieces of the plant, the propagules or the root, pieces of root, can get held up and spread with the roots. A lot of our weeds can be rhizomatous, which means they have a root system that spreads out laterally through the soil and will have new plants produced off of it. And if you separated that root, both those plants would be able to survive on their own. And then a lot of plants also, just a small piece of the stem or something like that, if it gets in the right conditions, can sprout a new plant. Animals are really good at moving weeds around. They stick to their fur, things like that. The same with people. People are really good at spreading weeds bring things over from other places, through shipping. A lot of ships have bilge that they'll fill up to keep the boat afloat and level. And then when they get to port and they empty the cargo, they'll dump the bilge. And there's a lot of seeds that get transported that way, in packing material, all sorts of fun things like that. Machinery can move weeds around a lot, especially if you have large equipment and you get a lot of mud and things like that hung up on it. Automobiles are really good at moving weed seeds around. Things like that. And then another way, contaminated materials. So say you're landscaping your yard and you get a load of bark in or something that could have a bunch of weed seeds in it you didn't know about. And now you have them in your yard and you inadvertently planted them where you didn't want to. And then one of the other big things for weeds is they really like disturbance. So any kind of soil disturbance, they really latch onto that. And then if you have plants that are stressed out, like if you had a lawn that you hadn't watered, things like that, the desired plants get stressed out, and it opens up the door for other things to move in. So another thing to keep in mind with this is something we call the soil seed bank. And it's kind of like a bank where you put money in, but this one is seeds go into the soil. Some seeds will germinate right away or within a year. Other seeds kind of get worked into the soil and will stay there for different amounts of time, depending on the seed and some biological structures and stuff. But there's seeds that can last over 100 years in the soil, just waiting for the right conditions to germinate. And a lot of these seeds will germinate when there's disturbance. Say you did some tilling or something like that. All of a sudden those seeds get moved up towards the surface and they're like, hey, and they go to town. So that's something too with management, is that you need to be thinking about, like, okay, I mean, you might have got rid of all the weeds this year, but next year you might have a whole new flush of stuff that comes up. And I'll keep doing that until those weeds are either dead or they've all exhausted their availability to germinate, or they've been removed by rodents or bugs or birds. There's a lot of things in the soil that eat seeds. So predation is a kind of an interesting thing for seeds, but that soil seed bank can last a really long time and keep a problem going. So just kind of something to think about. One of the big things, I think, if you're going to take on a weed problem or a new project, is to kind of have goals in mind, like what do you want to accomplish? And a lot of times those are going to be site specific, like even, two pieces of land 100 yards apart could have totally different soil types or compaction issues or totally different things going on. And so they're going to have different management strategies. And then it's really, I think, oriented to what, the landowner, what do you want to do with your property? Do you want it to be a beautiful lawn? Are you looking for pasture? Are you trying to convert it to prairie? So you got to kind of think about these things ahead of time. And I think it'll help, drive the decision-making process of how you deal with things when they come up. And, kind of making sure you have a good plan ahead of yourself. But also you need to be adaptive. When we look at issues with noxious weeds, are you willing to go the full gamut and try to eradicate them? Or are you just trying to reduce them to a manageable level? And then kind of there's like, what's your tolerance with that? Some people are like, nope, there can't be any of this weed in here. I'm getting rid of all of it. And other people are like, if there's a couple dandelions in the lawn, I don't care. That's okay. I'm fine with that. So kind of finding your balance, what you're comfortable with, I think is important. And when you go full eradication, and that's usually a lot more intensive and expensive up front, it'll definitely probably pay off in the long run. So you don't have a continual project to work on, but but having goals. So you do want to establish native plant species, because that, especially with Palouse prairie stuff, it's very popular around here to try to reestablish Palouse prairie. It has its own challenges. It can be very difficult, and it takes a lot of time. It's not something you're just going to throw some seeds on the ground and tomorrow you have prairie. It's going to be years down the road probably. And it's one of those things too, that it's something I'd say, take a small chunk and do that first. Don't try to do like 20 acres all at once. Because you might just end up with a weedier mess than you started with, and try to learn from, I got this one spot, this worked, this didn't, and be adaptive and change your management strategies, and then start applying that to more ground if that's what you want to do. Kind of, do you want to go back to what it once was? Which is kind of this idea of the prairie for here, or, if you're in Idaho, maybe you want forest and things like that. So kind of having the long-term goal in mind. And then with that, emulating what I would call a reference condition. A lot of places don't have them anymore, especially on the Palouse. A lot of, the prairie is gone. And so it's hard to be like, oh, this is what it should look like. These are the plants that are there. Those kind of things are limited and hard to find sometimes, but there's a lot of literature and historical records, things like that, if that's what you're interested in. Do you want to support specific wildlife species? Are you looking to get into pollinator habitat? That's a really hot issue right now, and very important. And I'm a beekeeper, so the more flowers people plant, the better for me. But kind of having those goals in mind and figuring out what you want to do, and then what you might, thinking about what you might have to battle to get there, I think will save you a lot of heartache in the long run. And I know this from experience, from working on these projects for a long time, but and then, with that, putting together a timeline. And there's kind of I like to use the succession in some of my plans, where it's a natural process where, let's say you had a forest fire. We have a major disturbance, all the large trees are gone, the dominant plants, and other things move in. So you get fireweed and other trees and shrubs that sprout, and they kind of start this change. And over time, the other species come back. And you can use that natural process to kind of drive what you're trying to create. And it also helps, if you kind of like, oh, I should use these plants now, and then we can move into other plants later and develop, the garden that way. And there's things that work together well, finding, sister species, things like that. And then kind of this, yeah, so the early adopter species, getting those established first, getting the weeds under control, and then you can start putting other things out rather than, I see people just like, oh, I'm going to plant 20 things all right now. And then they have these issues because they're not quite compatible yet. The system is not ready for more of the dominant long-term plants. So just kind of thinking about that and kind of having this natural system that can ultimately support itself, so that you're not out there having to weed all the time, where you get something that's vigorous and healthy going, and that helps suppress other things that are coming in that you don't want. And so there's kind of some different stages you can see on there. There's kind of the pioneer things, then other things move in. And kind of, especially if you're going like with forest stuff, they tend to go small to large, but just something to think about. And kind of thinking about what do you want to do versus what you can do. Not all pieces of ground can support everything, or you might need to do some soil amendments, things like that. And with that, if you're tilling things up, you might be driving weeds up to the surface, and you might have to deal with some things you didn't even know were in the ground for a while. But yeah, kind of working with what the land can tolerate, and then kind of like to have this idea of diminishing returns, that you put in the effort, and once you get to a certain point, it kind of takes care of itself. And you're not having to continually put more inputs into it and do more work. So, but getting into the real meat here, the methods for weed control. And this is not going to be a totally exhaustive list, because there are many, many things that you can do, and it really depends on what you're dealing with, and plant wise, and what you're trying to establish, or what your long-term goals are. And so this is kind of just a overview of what I would kind of call the 5 different methods of weed control. And within each of those, there's a broad spectrum of things that can be used. And these can be used together. It's not like you have to pick one method and just go with that. A lot of these are really good to go together and be synergistic. But the most important thing, I think, is identifying what you have, and it will tell you, help drive like how you are going to manage that weed. And if you don't know what it is, I like to say don't kill it yet. I've seen a lot of people take out plants that were beautiful native plants, and they thought they were a weed, and they weren't, and like that's really what we wanted and not this. And so there's a lot of misidentification, but there is a ton of resources out there. I mean, I've got probably 20 different weed identification books sitting on my desk. There's a lot of stuff on the web now. Yeah, there's apps on your phone. You just like click a picture of it. It probably will tell you what it is. They're getting a lot better. Some of them kind of crack me up, but and then the other thing is kind of scouting around too, especially if you have, acreage that you're dealing with, and just kind of walking around, figuring out what's there, and then kind of making that part of your routine, and doing it at different times of year. A lot of our weeds, especially annual grasses, things like that, they'll come up late in the fall, and then they start blooming in early spring before a lot of other things are even out of the ground. Also in the fall, there's a lot of things that come up as a rosette, and a lot of different plant types. So different times of year, there's different things out there. A lot of the weeds do persist for a long time on the landscape, but not always. And any good weed book or something is probably going to have a lot of things to help you identify the plants. They're going to use potentially a lot of jargon if you're not a botanist that you've never heard before. So it's kind of a fun learning experience, and it's so they have these keys and like, does the leaf look like this? Is the stem like this? Is the flower this color? Then it'll help you guide you to, it's kind of a map to figure out what the plant is. And then with that, once you identify what the plant is, there's going to be different methods that you might employ to control that. Just from kind of a basic plant standpoint, there's a lot of different types of weeds. We have broadleaf weeds that, like the dock here, that, obviously has a leaf on it. Grasses, then there's sedges and rushes, which are grass-like, but they behave differently. You're gonna find most of those are going to be places that are wet, along creeks, things like that, wetlands. There's the woody vegetation that can be very invasive, very problematic, shrubs and trees. Out on the Palouse, there's a lot of different non-native roses that are invading pastures and CRP ground. And they can be pretty problematic. They're not very fun to deal with. And there's a whole guide out. There's a guidebook that got put together by the Plant Materials Center in Pullman. It's available online. See if I can get you guys a link to that. That helps you identify the non-native roses versus native roses in this area. It's really helpful. And then there's also aquatic plants that can be really bad. You'll see if you go to a boat launch or something at a lake, a lot of times they need you to wash your boat off, or they'll check to make sure your boat is weed free, so you're not spreading things like milfoil and things like that from one location to another. And these weeds can also show up in people's yards if people have water features, things like that, or ponds. A lot of these aquatic plants find their way in there somehow. And then the other thing with kind of from a biology standpoint with plants is most weeds kind of can be broken into 3 different types, whether they're perennial, which means they come back from the root every year. Most of our weeds are what we call herbaceous, where at the end of the growing season, they die back to the ground or they die completely. And then, so the perennial ones, they come back from the rootstock every year. Biennials will, in the first year, open up usually as a rosette form, kind of like the dock here in the picture. And then the second year, they'll kind of just sit there, gather energy, store energy in a root, and from photosynthesis. And then the second year is when they bolt, and then they go to seed. And those seeds produce the next generation of plants. And then there's annuals. And so there's a lot of annual grasses that are issues out here: Ventonata, Medusa head, downy brome, cheatgrass. And then things like, there's a lot of other annuals, but these ones have to produce seed every year, and they come back from the seed. When the plant dies at the end of the growing season, that's it. And so they're really reliant on being able to go to seed. And so you can kind of start seeing where strategies for dealing with some of these plants come into place. If you have an annual weed, if you can prevent it from going to seed, it's not going to come back. I mean, there might be some seeds in that soil seed bank that I talked about, and they might come back for a couple of years. I mean, for the most part, I think the average seed life is maybe 5 years. A lot of annuals, it's a year or 2, 3 years, maybe. And same with a lot of the biennials. They're not usually long-lived seeds. The perennial plants, they don't have to go to flower every year. They don't have to produce seeds. If the conditions aren't right, they won't. Then they'll just store energy and wait till next year. And so a lot of times with that, the management strategies can be different depending on the type of plant you're dealing with and its growth pattern, and things like that. So let's see. So I think one of the first things for weed control is being preventative. And if you're going to undertake a disturbance of some kind on your ground, kind of thinking about like what might come up if I don't do anything. And you never know, but just kind of thinking about that in advance, like not to dog on like the highway department, but they put a new road in and there's a nice giant road cut and then they don't seed the road cut. And then all of a sudden it's either eroding or it's covered in weeds, so kind of be like, oh, that's going to happen. I got a plan for it. Um, keeping your equipment clean, covering loads. And so that, whether you're hauling stuff to the landfill or hauling grain down the road, get weed seeds in there and they can blow out, and you're spreading them across the landscape. And using weed-free materials. If you're a horse packer, a lot of Forest Service ground, things like that, they'll, require you to have weed-free, certified weed-free hay for your animals. And you can get, it's not always easy to find, but it's there. But, kind of thinking about like, what am I getting? Well, if you get a bunch of bark molds, you show up at the nursery and it's got a bunch of weeds growing in the pile, you're going to be bringing those home. So kind of trying to source things that don't have weeds so you can not have the weeds as well. Irrigation screens, this is probably more applicable to people that are irrigating crops, but screens can prevent propagules and seeds from flowing in and getting out on the fields. And then weed barriers, we'll talk about those more on the next slide. The use of cover crops is really awesome for a lot of different reasons. But basically cover crops, you're putting in, and I think we'll go over this, got a slide on this later, but you're putting in different mixes of plants that you want, and they can do different things. They can be helping with soil compaction issues, and breaking the soil up. They can be providing nutrients to the soil and things like that, but they're also really competitive with weeds. And so they can help suppress weed growth until what you want to put into the ground, you're ready to do that, or they can provide cover while those plants are trying to come up and get established, and then helps keep things weed free. But that's a whole nother, cover crops is a whole nother lecture. So, and then if you're contracting somebody to do work, don't be afraid to put in the contract that you want to make sure they clean their machinery before they bring it to your property, things like that, so that other people aren't spreading things for you, because it definitely happens. So weed barriers, there's a lot of different kind of weed barriers out there. Some of them are more aesthetically pleasing than others, but all of them have their kind of pluses and minuses. One that we use a lot here at the district for our riparian plantings is mulch fabric, or a geotextile. And it can be used, we usually use it in long strips when we're planting rows of trees like along a creek. It can be very effective in keeping weeds down and reducing competition around the plants you're trying to establish. And it goes down pretty quick, it's pretty easy. A lot of the times it gets used like in this photo here where they've got it in a garden, or kind of a farm setting. And you can reuse it usually, but it does kind of have a lifespan. There are some issues with it breaking down, and then when you go to remove it, it isn't always the funnest process, especially if it gets buried, or you got nicely established trees in it or something, kind of get it off around those without damaging your desired plants. And unfortunately, I don't think it looks awesome, but it can be very effective. And the other thing kind of goes with that is a similar kind of deal is solarization. And that's where you're covering ground. Like, let's say you have a big patch of weeds and you want to establish a vegetable garden in there. You would use a sheet of plastic. A lot of people use a clear plastic or something transparent, but you kind of seal the edges in and weight it down a little bit and leave it for an entire growing season, especially through the summer. and it basically turns into a greenhouse effect right at the surface of the soil, and it will superheat the soil. And if everything goes right, the temperature will get hot enough where it basically turns into a seed oven and cooks all the weed seeds, and anything that's trying to germinate underneath it. It kind of can spark germination because it is like greenhouse until it gets too hot, and then you start kind of cooking the weeds, and you can actually get rid of a lot of the seeds in the seed bank. And then the next year, you can start planting what you want in there. Um, and it's pretty cost effective. You can cover, large pieces of the ground with it if you want, or, small areas. It works pretty well. You can use things like cardboard, putting it down in layers. A lot of times if we do that, we'll cover the cardboard afterwards with bark, or some kind of mulch material, mostly just make sure it doesn't blow away, but it can be really effective from keeping things from coming up and going through that. And kind of like with solarization, after a year or so, you can plant right through it. It starts to break down, and you just plant right through it. You don't have to take it out. It's kind of nice, but it's got a limited lifespan. And usually cardboard is readily available, and you come steal it out of our cardboard dumpster out back. I won't tell anybody. And then there's a lot of different kinds of natural mulch that people use, which could be, bark, shredded trees, things like that. This picture here, and they're in a vineyard, I believe, and they grew a bunch of grass between the rows of grapes, and then they mowed it down and just left it there. And they created like a nice thick, I think that's probably 3 or 4 inch thick layer of just grass that'll, decompose naturally, but it will suffocate anything that's trying to come up through it. And then you have kind of a natural sink for carbon and things like that, and you're not having to apply chemicals, things like that. So it could be a really nice alternative. And then bark mulch, which I talked about. And a lot of landscape or tree companies will give it to you. You can buy it at the nursery or home building supply. The one caution I would have is to maybe know what's in it or why that, especially if it's a tree company that took somebody's tree down the street down. Why did they take it down? Because if it's because it was full of bugs and now they just put it all on your yard, you might not want that. So just kind of a cautionary tale, something to kind of think about. The next kind of method is what I would call a cultural method of weed control, where there's, it's kind of how like a land base, how you're using the ground, and what kind of systems you're using on the ground, from kind of a human standpoint. And that can be things like crop rotation. So if, this might be more for if you're, growing, wheat or your farm or something, is that you're putting different plants in the ground every year and not the same thing every time over and over. For a lot of different reasons, but rotating crops, it kind of helps keep things diverse, helps your soils more, and it also helps break the weed like cycles for different weeds to move in. If you're constantly growing the same plant over and over again, there's going to be a weed that's going to be like, oh, I found a niche next to this plant and I can compete with it. Grazing management is really important. If you have animals, trying to maintain healthy pastures and moving them when you need to, and trying not to stress out a pasture, that you're overgrazing it, things like that. Because once those grasses get stressed, it opens up the door for weeds to move in, and then you have a new problem to deal with, and your forage levels are then diminishing. And then planting competitive species. So if you have getting plants that are vigorous and hardy, and trying to get a good mix of things, I think is also usually good. And even in a garden setting, kind of things that flower at different times, things that come up at different times. And this kind of goes with cover crops as well. Like the goal with cover crops a lot of the time is to always have something growing on the soil, to not have bare soils. And that you're controlling what is growing there, and that will help control things you don't want growing there. There's a lot of different cover crop mixes out there. A lot of them have warm season grasses, cool season grasses, different kinds of radishes and turnips and all sorts of fun stuff. And at the end of its life, it's done, and then you put in something else, and you got a bunch of free work. Well, I mean, you got to buy the seed, but they work really well. And then the other thing is irrigation and using irrigation control. So, and that can be a lot of different things. I really like drip irrigation, but I like drip irrigation where you're putting the emitter into the ground and watering the plant specifically that you want watered, not watering everything. And so you're not watering things you don't want to come up. Plus there's some potential water efficiencies there. And kind of controlling, when you water and how much you water, things like that. And just kind of keep an eye on things. Can be an effective way to control certain types of weeds in different situations, especially with potted plants or things like that, where, if you have drip emitters in each one and you don't have a bunch of other random things that come up with it, if you're just watering the plants you want in there. Oh yeah, cover crops. So I kind of already covered this. So you're getting something out there that is competitive with the weeds, and it helps protect what you seeded a lot of times. So like if you're doing a Palouse prairie, you want to put in native grasses, they don't come up very fast. They're a little bit different than like a lawn mix. And a lot of them are bunch grasses, so they have space in between them that they haven't filled in yet until they get established. And so a lot of times if we're putting down native grass seed, I'll put in to the mix some kind of a sterile wheat or a sterile ryegrass. So it'll come up, it's big, it's competitive with the weeds, it has space underneath for your native grasses to kind of get established. Really helps reduce erosion, which is nice. And then it's sterile, so it doesn't go back to seed when it's done with its life cycle. And hopefully then your grasses have at least started getting established. And so it's just kind of and then you have something growing out there. It's not just dirt that's waiting for weed seeds to blow into it. And then so physical. This is, putting the metal down, getting dirty with your hands, pulling weeds. There's a lot of different kinds of tillage equipment out there, a lot of different kinds of mowers that can be really effective at maintaining weeds. And one of those things, especially with mowers, timing can be really important. So if you've got things that are coming up, they're just about to, flower, go to seed, you get that mowed off at that point in time, they're not going to seed now, or they have to use a lot of energy to try to put a new seed head up before the end of the season. So it's going to be mowing is we mow a lot on our project sites. It can be really effective. And a lot of the stuff that we want to grow isn't affected by the mowing. A lot of the native grasses, things like that, they can take a little bit of mowing and they're fine. And then we can kind of hack off the weeds, and you can adjust height of mowers, things like that too. But then clipping seed heads. So things do come up. We do this a lot with teasel. It's got kind of a pine cone looking flower, and we just take like a bucket or a bag, snip them off in the bucket before they're able to disperse seeds, and they're done for the year. They're a biennial, so they're done at that point. And then you've collected all the seeds, and you can remove those and do what you want with them. So that can be really effective. It's kind of like deadheading, a flower garden or something, but just removing all the seed heads before they're able to disperse. Um, Fire can be a really good tool for weed control. I mean, you don't have to get, totally extreme with a giant flamethrower in the back of your tractor. But there's a lot of weeds that are very susceptible to heat. It'll burst the cells inside the leaves, things like that. There's some handheld ones that are basically just a torch, and you can go and burn out specific weeds with it. Do be cautious, you don't light everything on fire, of course. The brute strength method where you're out there just pulling things, um, and and then handheld equipment. And with some of this stuff, it's kind of the tool that's most effective might depend on how big of a weed issue you're working with. If it's a couple weeds in a small patch of the corner of the yard, just pulling them by hand is probably going to be pretty effective. If it's 3 acres of thistles, you're going to probably need to, size up how you're doing it. You're not going to be able to pull those by hand. And if you do, you're awesome. But I like being efficient. So yeah, mowing, kind of talked about timing with that already. And getting in there, trying to get things mowed off before they go to seed. And then and this is one of those pieces of equipment too, that if you're moving it from one place to another, you really want to make sure that you clean it off. There's a lot of seeds and things like that. They can get lodged up in there, or just even sitting on top that don't blow off on the truck on the side of the highway, which you don't want because you don't want to be spreading weeds. But and then the other thing with mowing is you do have to be kind of careful sometimes with your damage control, especially if you have, oh, we just planted a bunch of nice little shrubs in here, the grass came up, kind of knowing where those trees are, or flagging them or staking them or something, so you're not accidentally mowing things off you don't want. The other thing, especially if you have wildlife and deer around, is that fawns will not move from where they're sitting. So you have to be kind of careful, maybe scout out things, make sure you're not going to run over an animal or a rock or a log that you can't see. So just kind of being careful. And then I highly encourage people to always use their personal protective equipment, PPE, especially with things like mowers, because you don't want to lose a toe or something like that. So I always recommend at least closed-toed shoes and pants. So and if you're using a weed whacker, goggles are not a bad idea. Those things can throw stuff all over the place. So just kind of, know your tool and protect yourself and get rid of weeds. There's a lot of different handheld tools out there. I'm sure a lot of you guys have some of these. A shovel can be really effective at getting rid of a lot of plants, especially annual and biennial plants, and a lot of perennials. If you can separate the crown of the plant, which is where the plant goes from being roots to a stem, usually right at the soil surface or right below the soil surface. If you can separate the roots from the shoots, it's a really effective way to get rid of a lot of different kinds of weeds. There's a picture here of what I call a hula hoe or a stirrup hoe. You just go around, scratch, scratch, scratch. They're really effective in garden beds, especially like if you have a lot of little weed seedlings coming up. They just cut the root right off, pull the seedling out. You can do a lot of work really fast. And they're pretty easy to use, doesn't take a lot of real grunt work. This girl in the other picture, she's using something called a weed wrench. These are pretty effective tools for removing more woody vegetation, like if you had a bunch of those non-native wild roses you want to get rid of or something like that. Basically just has a kind of a biter at the end, and when you pull on it, it squeezes up, grabs the plant, and with leverage pulls the plant and the roots right out of the ground. They're kind of fun to use, but definitely get a workout. They're a little heavy. And then one of the other tools in the toolbox of weed control, of course, is the use of herbicides. And I know a lot of people don't like using herbicides, but they can be very effective. There's a lot of different options with it. And depending on what you're trying to get rid of, they can be very, very effective. But I would say that if you are going to use herbicides, that you always need to follow what's on the label. And the label, it's not just the label slapped on the bottle. Usually it peels back. It's like a booklet or some kind of leaflet, and it'll give you all the plants that it's effective on, different kinds of timing, maybe when to apply it, different weather conditions, temperatures, the rate you need to mix it at. So there's a lot of information there, but it's a really good thing to use. Some chemicals, depending on the size of what you're doing, may require you to get an applicator license. If you're not doing it commercially, probably you won't need it. If it's just at home, you should be fine. If you're buying it at the hardware store, you're not going to need something like that, but it is something to consider if you're doing large acreage or if you're hiring yourself out. And then, of course, using good PPE again. Supposedly herbicides are not supposed to hurt people, but I don't always trust all of that, and no need to risk it. We skip something. Oh, here we go. So there's different things with herbicides to take to mind. One of them is what's called mode of action, and it's how the herbicide works in the plant. And there's a lot of there's, I think, 24 different mode of actions right now, if not more, and they all do different things. And it just and they do different things at different kinds of plants. So we have this thing, selectivity, what does it kill, what doesn't it kill? There's herbicides that will only kill broadleaf plants. There's herbicides that will kill everything, like your glyphosate. And there's things that will only kill grasses, things that only kill annual grasses. And so there's kind of a different host of things, and they all work a little different in the plant. So it's kind of one of those things why you need to know what you're dealing with plant wise. And so that you can, get the right tool out there. And then, with a lot of plants, you need to have good coverage on the plant to make sure you can't just get one leaf and expect it to kill the entire plant. The plant has what's called phloem and xylem in it, and they're basically straws in the plant that move nutrients and water. Xylem only goes up from the ground. Phloem takes in energy from the leaves, goes to the roots, brings energy back out of the roots, the carbohydrates, the sugars. And so it can, depending on the herbicide, you can get it in there, especially with if you're dealing with Canada thistle. You really want to kill the root. So if you get something that's a systemic herbicide that will move down in the phloem, not just out with the xylem to kill the leaves, you'll get to the root, be pretty effective. And then there's also timing issues. Usually the smaller the plant is, the easier it will be to get rid of. And that kind of goes through for a lot of these methods, especially with spraying. It's a lot easier to get rid of a seedling than it is a full grown plant. Plus you use a lot less material. Yeah, and the timing on things, there's different times of year. If I was going to be doing control for annual grasses, say Vetinata or Downy Brome, I probably would have sprayed it in November, about a month ago. Once those grasses emerged and they're still growing, they haven't kind of shut down yet for the winter, or maybe early in the spring when they kind of start up again before they start going to seed. Other things aren't even out of the ground yet at that point. So you prevent a lot of what we call off-target effects. Where you're not spraying things you don't want to, or you're spraying dead plant material because it's, died back to the ground. So it's not going anywhere. Herbicides don't move through dead plants. It is good to think about herbicide resistance, especially if you use the same product over and over again. And then there's a lot of different kind of application methods that can be pretty effective. We do a lot of spot spraying where you're just kind of going out with a backpack sprayer usually, and you're spraying, selectively spraying just the weeds you want to. You can also have, a lot of ATVs. You can get a sprayer on those with a, like a gun or something. There is different methods that we use if there are plants that we don't want to spray, but we need to spray the weeds right next to it. We either put a bucket over the plant, we'll put like a handle on the bottom of the bucket and cap the plant around it. Or you can, kind of like this picture here, where there's a cup around the end of the sprayer nozzle. So you're putting that, we use milk jugs sometimes, cut the bottom out and tape them on there. So whatever you put that cone over, that's all it's getting sprayed. Nothing outside of that is getting sprayed. So kind of the opposite of the bucket. And then one of the other things we do with our backpack sprayers a lot is put dye in it, which you don't want to get on your skin because it will turn you blue or purple for a while. But it lets you know, like, oh, I sprayed that one, I didn't spray that one. It's really effective too if you have more than one person out spraying an area, so you're not both spraying the same plant. And then you can also kind of make sure you get good coverage, and it'll stay on the plant for a while. A bunch of blue thistles out there. It's pretty fun. Wick applicators and rope applicators can be really effective. And basically, so rope applicator is a piece of rope stretched out that's been soaked in herbicide, or it has a delivery system that kind of keeps it wet. And you just wipe it on the weeds. Like this one here is on a side-by-side. You can set the height differently. So if you have, weeds are this tall and your other plants are this tall, you can just run it across the weeds and you don't get anything on the stuff you want. And then the wick applicators, there's several different kinds. There's this one, it's like basically a hockey stick with a paint roller on the end. And it's a PVC tube, and you fill the tube with herbicide, and it kind of leaks out as you wipe it on things. You basically just paint the plants that you want to get rid of. There's ones that have a tiny sponge on the bottom, so you can just kind of bloop, bloop, like stamp the weeds. The nice things about these are you can really target exactly what you want to get, and the use of the amount of herbicide you're using is really low because you're not just putting it everywhere, you're putting it directly on just the things you want to get rid of. There's basal bark treatments. These are really good for trees and shrubs that you want to control. We use a lot for like false indigo, salt cedar, a couple of things like that. You use a very low amount of herbicide, usually in a pretty high concentration, but so you don't have to spray the entire plant. You don't have to cover a whole bush. You just hit some of the stems. It goes in and kills the roots, and then you have a dead rose bush or whatever it happens to be that you don't want. Something to think about that though is I would probably use some sort of what they call basal bark oil, which helps the herbicide stick to the bark of the plant and also breaks up some of the tissues of the bark and the cambium layer underneath that, so that the herbicide can get into the plant and be effective. And then if you are using something like a basal bark oil, make sure you have the right herbicide formulation. Some herbicides are meant to be mixed with water, and some are meant to be mixed with oil substances. So there is some differences there to think about. The other thing with this is you have a pretty extended time frame of when you can apply it. Some of these things can be applied in the fall after the leaves are all fallen off, which is really nice because then you have a lot better exposure to the stems, especially if it's like a big cascading rose bush, something like that. So it'll be pretty effective. And then kind of with that is cut stump applications. This one here is a salt cedar, a tamarisk. I don't know what the other one she's painting there is, but cut it down and then immediately paint the stump with herbicide, and it goes into the root system so that doesn't come back to life. And then kind of a similar deal is stem injectors. We use a lot for controlling knotweed, some other things, but there's some different kind of things, or you can do the homemade method with a hatchet and a spray bottle. But they can be pretty effective for infestations. This is a little bit labor intensive, but and then there's some other things out there just keep in mind that are more up and coming. Drones are becoming more and more of a thing for weed control. And then we call, excuse me, herbicide ballistic technology. These guys are in a helicopter shooting paintballs filled with herbicide at invasive species in the jungle. It looks like a lot of fun. I need to get a ride along someday, but there's always new technology coming out for these kind of things. So it's one of those things to kind of keep in mind. The next one method is biological control. And this is using insects that will get into the plant. There's a lot of different kinds of ways. A lot of them are beetles and weevils, and they'll get into the roots. They'll get into the stems. Sometimes they'll get into the flower itself, and they lay eggs in there, or that's where they overwinter. And they, especially with like seed weevils and stem weevils, they lay eggs in there, and then the young eat their way out as they grow, and they can be very effective at controlling plants that you don't want. They are very well regulated by the government, by mostly the Department of Ag in each state. And so they are also when they do that, they want to make sure that if you release this, it doesn't affect other plants. They're very, very host specific. So you get a beetle for one kind of plant, and that is all it will attack. And they can be very effective. There's some other things out there that are a little bit newer that people have been using, different kinds of funguses and smut. So there's a picture here of some Danny Brown cheatgrass that has a smut in it, which effectively is a fungus that attacks or lives on the seed head of the plant and eats the seed. Basically, it sucks all the nutrients out of the seed. It lives off that, and the seed never germinates, or is not able to germinate after that. Especially with something like an annual grass, that can be very effective controlling it. There's some companies out there that have it, so now you can pretty much apply it like you would an herbicide. You can spray a whole field with it. It is effective on some other annual grasses as well, I believe, and there's a couple of ones out there. And the other thing to think about with that though too, especially if you remove a giant field of cheatgrass, I know with some of the trials they were doing with this product early on, they're like, oh yeah, it was awesome. It took out all the cheatgrass, and they came back a year later and there was no cheatgrass, but there was a whole bunch of Medusa head instead. And so you need to kind of think about, and this is with any weed control, though, what are you replacing it with? Because if you don't replace it with something, another weed is just going to take that as an opportunity to move in. So just kind of, thinking about that, like, okay, if we get rid of the weed, then what are we going to do to make sure you have something that you want growing there, and not just introducing another thing you don't want. A lot of times you see there's like this rose gall here. That's a bug living inside of that rose bush, effectively making it so that everything beyond that point is not producing new seed or flowers. And they can be pretty effective. You see a lot of these on non-native roses around here. I've never seen one on a native wild rose, so they're pretty fun. And then I kind of touched on this earlier, but I would definitely combine different methods, kind of have a holistic approach. There's a lot of tools in the toolbox kind of thing. There's not usually a one size fits all for weed control. And so, kind of using different things, and you'll learn a lot as you go through dealing with what you're dealing with, of what works, what doesn't, and then being able to be, being adaptive to that. Okay, like this worked, this didn't work, I'm not going to do that again. And then trying to figure out, a new effective strategy. Maybe we need to use a different tool or double down on something, to be more effective with our management strategy. And then the other thing that I think is really important to do is monitoring, to make sure what you're doing is effective, not just like, I threw it out there and it's cool. And then also to know like kind of what the extent of the issue is. Like You're kind of going out scouting around like, hey, I've never seen that plant before. Maybe I should figure out what it is before it blows up and then turns into a huge new problem for you. Um, but also to make sure that like, hey, I did this and it was really effective. That's awesome. I'm gonna do that again. Um, and then EDRR, early detection and rapid response. You do find that one exotic plant in your yard and you figure out what it is. You're like, oh, that's on the noxious weed list. Oh, instead of thinking, oh, there's just one of them, I'll be fine. Like, get rid of it before it turns into 50 overnight, and then you have a huge issue on your hands that you now have to deal with. So uh, there are tons, like I said, there's tons of resources out there. I think Liz is going to email everybody at least this list, plus I'll throw a bunch more stuff on there. But there's a lot of different noxious weed boards. The county extension agents are really good, both at WSU and U of I for weeds. The county has weed boards, weed departments. There is a ton of books. The Weeds of the West is one of my all-time favorite books. I don't know if everybody needs it. It's a little thick, but it is very thorough about all the weeds that you might ever find out here. Um, the Nez Perce in Lapway have a biocontrol center where they breed biocontrol agents, bugs, for release into noxious weed situations. And I almost think they give them away for free. Don't quote me on that, but they're definitely a great resource. There's also a group out of Montana that will just mail you like bugs in the mail, and you can go out and release those, in your field or your garden or whatever, if you have issues with different plants. And like I said, I mean, there's like U of I Extension, they've got all these different, this little flip books of here's a plant, how do you deal with it, kind of things. There's a lot of free literature out there. You don't have to go buy Weeds of the West. And then there's, the internet is an amazing source of information these days. To try to figure out what things are, and different strategies of dealing with it. And then also the NRCS and the USDA have really great resources as well, and they do a lot of the research on this, as well as universities. So yeah, that wraps up what I have. So I don't know. Do we have time for Q&A, Liz?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Randy. Yeah, for those who need to step out, thank you so much for joining us. But I do know there are a lot of questions, so we are gonna hang around for a few minutes and try to get as many answered as we can. If we don't answer your question, as Randy mentioned, I will be sending out an email tomorrow with a whole bunch of resources. And then you also always have Palouse Conservation District as a resource as well. So don't fret if we can't get to everything tonight. But Charlotte had a really great question. Randy, are you aware of any resources that are available to help us compare like native plants that look similar to invasive plants so that we don't have to key out species if we aren't running into issues of, accidentally misidentifying things?
Yeah, there are. Like I mentioned, the book for the publication, I guess, for the wild rose identification, through the Plant Materials Center, does a good job of going through non-natives and natives and what the differences are. And there are a lot of the weed books and weed ID books, a lot of them will have like also looks like this species, and here's how to tell the two apart. And a lot of, no, they're not like, some of them are just like, here's a picture, and but a lot of them actually have really good descriptions. And then there's like, here's all the similar species, and here's the one or two things to look for. They'll help tell them apart, so that you aren't accidentally taking out cow parsnip instead of poison hemlock or something. And there are a lot that look very similar, and I have been in many situations where people have confused things. So and I think but yeah, there's definitely some pretty easy guides out there for some of that stuff. I can't think of any straight, like really good ones right off the top of my head, but they definitely exist. So
Cool. Speaking of poison hemlock, what do you think is an effective way to get rid of it?
so poison hemlock is susceptible to being sprayed by just about everything, especially when it's in its rosette stage. So it's a biennial. So it comes up year one as a what kind of looks like a fern. Year two, it shoots up giant, 10-foot stalk. If you can get it year one, boom, spraying is really easy. There are some really good biocontrols out there that basically defoliate the entire plant and eat all the seeds and flowers off of it. That can be really effective at wiping out large populations. I think those are probably available at the Nez Perce Biocontrol Center. People collect them in the region off other sites where they already exist. They can be really effective. A shovel is a really good way to get rid of it if you don't have a huge patch. All you got to do is just right underneath the soil, clip the top of the rosette off, and it's done. It won't come back. And the other nice thing with poison hemlock is that it has a really short soil seed bank life. The seed won't persist for more than 3 years in the soil, if that. So if you can, and it's biennial. So if you can get it kind of on top of it for a couple of years in a row, you can probably wipe out the problem.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. We just got another question talking about bindweed. A lot of questions came in with registration asking about bindweed. Someone described it as their personal nemesis. So can you talk about chemical and non-chemical interventions for bindweed?
Yes, bindweed is a tricky one. It is definitely not the easiest thing to get rid of. For a few different reasons. One, it has a massive root system, and it doesn't take very much of that root. So in a farm field, let's say you had some bindweed on one corner and you tilled through the field and you're like, oh, I got rid of the bindweed. I buried it all. It's awesome. And then next year you have bindweed that follows the direction of you drove the tractor in, and it spreads like an inch of the root of that plant will produce an entirely new plant. It's kind of scary. So chemically, there are some pretty effective chemicals out there. Pretty much a lot of broadleaf chemicals will do it, or glyphosate, things like that. Glyphosate also will kill everything else, so kind of be careful with that kind of thing, and just kind of know what the herbicide does when you're applying it. Non-herbicide control of it can be very difficult. You're going to be pulling it for years, probably. I mean, the more you can reduce its above ground biomass, the more it will tax the below ground biomass, and eventually it will run out of energy in the roots, and not be able to, put up leaves and garner more energy from the sun. But it can be hard, especially when it's wrapped around other plants. And I would say too that if I was pulling it, I would definitely be careful of what I did with the plant material afterwards. To kind of, I probably wouldn't throw it in my compost bin because it would just start growing again out of your compost bin. But there are a lot of herbicides out that are pretty effective on it. The mechanical or kind of the non-herbicide dealing with it is a lot trickier. Yeah, I don't have a great answer for that, but a lot of hand pulling, I think, and you might get somewhere 20 years from now, unfortunately. But
Thank you. How about ventonata?
Ventonata, Ventonata, wiregrass, has become a huge problem in this area recently. That's probably why you're asking about it. And for something that's so small and looking, I don't know how it dominates fields and things like that. The most effective way that I've seen, and I did some research on this I was back in grad school in Palouse prairie remnants, and then also there's been a lot of work in hay fields and pastures recently. There are a couple of different herbicides that are pretty effective at removing annual grasses, including Ventonata, Medusa head, downy brome. And there are ones that are labeled for, there's more labeled for use in crop and pasture settings than there are in non-crop areas like a prairie remnant. But there are things out there that are effective. There's some really good literature from the University of Idaho that came out recently about it. And there's a couple good papers that are pretty easy to find online that will list out. There's probably, I want to say there's about 5 different herbicides that have proven to be pretty effective on getting rid of vetinata. And the other thing with that is that you want to make sure that if you do get rid of it, that you get a vigorous stand of something else growing in there, or try to enhance, the grasses, the other grasses that are desirable, whether it's a prairie setting or a pasture or something like that. There are people that have used fertilizer to get the pasture grasses growing more vigorously and to get it to so they're more competitive, and tried to get them to outcompete vetinata. I think there's been some success with that, but I'm not sure where that is at right now, but that might be something to look into.
Cool, thank you. Um, we received a question asking, is it even possible to turn a field of thistle into native prairie? And as a follow-up, could you also just briefly discuss the native thistle that we have here in the Palouse as well?
Yes, it is possible. I mentioned this in my talk, though, that I wouldn't try to do it all at once. The first step is going to be to try to get the weeds under control. And I would probably start with native grasses while doing that. Idaho fescue, blue bunch wheatgrass, maybe sandberg bluegrass, some things like that, and trying to get those established. And that will, especially with thistles, allow you a lot of different options to get rid of the thistles while the grass takes hold. And then once you get a good handle on the thistles, which might, really be several years down the road, then you can kind of start bringing in more forbs and flowering plants, things like that. But I think if you can get a hardy stand of grass established in there while getting rid of the thistles, then yes, but it is going to be a labor of love, probably. It is doable, but it can be kind of a lengthy process. The one native thistle we have on the Palouse is called the Palouse thistle, and it definitely doesn't, it looks like a thistle, but it is definitely also, especially once you see it, looks a lot different than most of the other thistles around here. So most of the thistles will be like Canada thistle, Scotch thistle, bull thistle, and a lot of those are a lot pricklier. They're a lot more spiny. The Palouse thistle has an almost white flower on it. It's a very light green to white colored. And it's got a lot lighter shade of green on the leaf top. And on the bottom of the leaf, it is kind of a white silver color. None of the other thistles around here have that white underleaf, and their leaves tend to be a little bit darker green. Also, it's usually a lot shorter. It doesn't usually get more than 12 to 18 inches tall. A lot of Canada thistle, things like that, those will be 3 feet tall, 4 feet tall even. But there definitely are several patches of it around. So yeah, light
Cool.
green, silver leaf on the bottom.
Thank you. Dave asked a question that we're very familiar with the district. How do you deal with reed canary grass?
With an excavator, and you dig it out 18 inches deep to get rid of all the roots. Reed canary grass, unfortunately, I don't think we're ever gonna get rid of all of it. It is very well established everywhere. But a lot of when we do try to do control on it, a lot of times it involves a lot of mowing, weed eaters, things like that, and just beating it back. There are a lot of people that say shading it out helps, which it does, but that requires you to establish, trees that are a lot taller and bigger than it, which takes a lot of time. But But with like a lot of our, riparian buffer projects, we mow it down, we put tarp it, like we'll put mulch fabric over the top of it if we're planting in it. And depending on how far away from the creek we are, because that's the other thing, it usually grows right on the edge of the creek, so we don't want that stuff getting flooded and pulled out. But and there are definitely some different herbicides, things like that you can use that are pretty effective. There is a glyphosate that is labeled for use on and around water. So that can be an effective tool. And it's supposed to be fish friendly. They actually use it to spray milfoil in lakes, it's kind of a weird process, and in creeks. But yeah, just beating it back. If you can physically remove the sod, that helps a lot. But it does have a pretty dense, and I mean, the root system is usually about 18 inches thick or deep. And it comes back. We even find things that are competitive with it. That helps. Sometimes we can get some different sedges and rushes to grow in the spaces where we take it out, and they can be effective, and they'll compete with it. And then if we plant willows in it, we plant a lot of willows from cuttings, and we usually leave them really, really long. We'll put in like 6 to 10 feet tall cuttings that sit above the canopy of the grass so that they can start leafing out and establishing better and just not have to compete with the grass as much. And we've had pretty good success with trying to get other things like willows in there to compete with it, or dogwoods. But yeah, unless you want to shade it out, I mean, you can put a huge piece of, geotextile, like mow it down and bury it, basically geotextile, and eventually it'll stop trying to come through it. But that only works in certain situations where if you got a nice big flat spot or something, and you're not worried about the river coming up and tearing it all out. But
Yep, gotcha. You mentioned like solarization and using plastic on the ground to kind of kill everything underneath. Does that also work on fungus that you're trying to get rid of?
I would imagine so. I don't know. I've never used it for that before, but yeah, I mean, it basically, I would think so. It's like an oven. It'll kind of kill everything in the top couple inches of the soil. Some of those get really hot. They'll be 130 degrees or something like that underneath, and it kills all the living things underneath. So I would think so.
Okay. You mentioned also using sterile wheat or ryegrass. Where can one get seeds for that?
We usually get it from one of the seed companies in Lewiston. Clearwater Seed has it usually, or there's several grass seed companies in Spokane that carry it. Every once in a while, you might be able to get it at Poland Building Supply. I don't know. I actually haven't looked for it there, but yeah, they just sell it by the bag. You can, get 10 pounds, you can get 50 pounds. It's really easy to apply. We usually just throw it out by hand. And you can actually cover quite a bit of ground pretty fast with the bucket full of that stuff. So
Awesome, cool, thank you. Do you have any recommendations for getting rid of cucumber vine?
cucumber vine. I don't know what cucumber vine is. Well, I have seen it, but it was on the coast. I'm gonna maybe guess that they're talking about white briny.
Yeah, Dave, if you're still on, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself if you'd like to, if you have anything to clarify.
Because there is a cucumber vine. It's actually a native plant, but it grows over on the west side. White briny is becoming a big problem.
It's Bryony that we're talking about. Thank
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's a little bit tricky. The most effective way that we've dealt with it is digging up the root. Because you can pull it as much as you want. It'll keep coming back from that root. Trying not to let it go to seed is really important too, because it's spread by birds. That's why a lot of times it's in like a hawthorn thicket or underneath pine trees and stuff, is the birds eat it, and they poop out the seed, and then you get a new plant. But it grows a pretty sizable tuber. And if you can get that thing dug up out of the ground, that's the most effective way to deal with it. It's really hard to spray, usually because it's growing over the top of another tree or plants that you want to not get sprayed. And when it's young, you can usually just pull it, but if it's been there a while, just trying to find where those roots are and dig those up seems to be the most effective way to deal with it. It's a little labor intensive, and sometimes you have to crawl under some thorny bush you don't want to, but and unfortunately the birds really like it. But
Yep. How about like people who have weeds on slopes? Do you have any recommendations for how to ease weed maintenance in those trickier areas?
I guess it would depend on how steep and tall it is. That's a great question. I mean, we do it a lot. I mean, I don't know. We usually just take the weed eaters out and mow everything down, but and you can get pretty good with the weed eater on a slope. Like we do it a lot, like on stream banks, things like that. I guess to a point where you're definitely not taking the mower down there, but weed eaters are pretty good. Backpack sprayer maybe, or if you had a 4-wheeler with a sprayer on the back, a lot of those sprayers will have pretty good distance with the spray gun, and you can adjust the nozzle so it's more of a stream, so you can really kind of right on the plants you want. Or you make the teenager next door go do it. Hand him a hoe. But yeah, I don't know. We usually just use the weed eater and kind of go cross slope and mow stuff down. Because a lot of times it's usually grassy stuff, but
Cool. Thank you. I think we might just have time for one more question here. So Judy asked, trying to get rid of dock and is having to dig it out the long root and then spraying it because spraying the leaves hasn't been effective. She's asking for suggestions on how to manage that. And Judy, if you have any interest in unmuting as well to clarify, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, with the dock, I think it's one of those ones that if you can get a shovel or a hoe in the ground and separate the crown from the root, a lot of times that's pretty effective because it is hard to pull out. I think if you get enough of the crown separated off, I don't think it's going to want to come back to life off the rest of the root portion. And pulling it's not very fun. And maybe, I don't know, maybe trying spraying with something else, but I don't know. I haven't done a lot of control of dock. It's not been too big of a problem on most of our sites, but usually we just pull it. There's only a couple, or we just take a shovel to it. But and it seems to work okay. And with the shovel too, the other thing you can do is slide it kind of down next to the root, and then pop the root and the whole plant out, and kind of use it to loosen the root up. And then if you can get a hold of the plant, a lot of times you get a lot of the root out with it that way. It could be pretty effective, and usually they're not in really dense patches, but you can go pretty far pretty quick.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you.